He spent 2 years hiding his wife from the world, replacing her at every gala, every summit, every glittering room that mattered, because he decided she didn't fit the image of a man like him. Kang Do-hyun controlled empires, crushed enemies, and never lost. But the morning she vanished, 3 of his most powerful international partners canceled within hours, and one of them said 7 words that broke something permanent inside him. Your wife was the only reason we trusted you. Now he's chasing a ghost across 3 countries, and every city he enters, the world already knows her name. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. Us. The gala was the kind of event Do-hyun attended the way other men attended dentist appointments. Necessary, unpleasant, performed with a fixed expression that communicated nothing. The Gangnam Convention Hall had been dressed in white orchids and soft gold lighting, the kind of aesthetic that cost more than most people earned in a year and was meant to signal wordlessly that everyone inside had already won. Waitstaff moved in practiced silence between clusters of men in bespoke suits and women in architectural gowns. Somewhere above the crowd, a string quartet played something European and forgettable. Do-hyun stood near the east terrace with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, listening to Park Sung-joon, a venture capital director who had been trying to position himself as indispensable to the Kong organization for the better part of 18 months, talk about infrastructure investment opportunities in Busan. Do-hyun nodded at intervals. He had learned long ago that powerful men rarely needed to be listened to. They needed to feel listened to. The distinction saved him enormous amounts of actual attention. Beside him, close enough that her bare shoulder occasionally brushed his sleeve, stood the woman he had brought tonight. Her name was Ji Yeon. She was a model who did this kind of work, accompanied men to functions, looked beautiful, said appropriate things to appropriate people, and was compensated accordingly. She was the 4th woman Do-hyun had brought to events like this in the past 10 months. They all had the same quality: presence without complication. His phone buzzed. He didn't check it immediately. Park Sung-joon was reaching the part of his pitch where the numbers were supposed to sound impressive, and Do-hyun needed to register at least a flicker of engagement before extracting himself from the conversation. The preliminary projections put us at, send it to my office. Do-hyun set his untouched scotch on a passing tray. Director Choi handles initial reviews. He'll know if it's worth my time. Park Sung-joon's smile compressed slightly. Of course. Do-hyun excused himself and walked toward the terrace windows, pulling his phone from his inside jacket pocket. The message was from Nia. I'm leaving. Don't look for me until you understand why. He read it twice. The second time slower, not because the words were complicated, but because his first instinct, a sharp, reflexive irritation, told him something was wrong with his own reaction. Nia didn't send messages like this. Nia sent messages asking whether he'd eaten, reminding him about calls he'd scheduled and forgotten, occasionally forwarding articles about places she'd read about and thought he might find interesting. Not this. He typed back, "We'll talk when I'm home." The message delivered. She didn't respond. He put the phone away and spent another 90 minutes working the room the way it needed to be worked. A word to the chairman of a pharmaceutical group that was quietly moving toward the Kang umbrella. A handshake with a retired general whose connections in the defense procurement sector were worth cultivating. A brief exchange with a French industrialist whose interpreter struggled to keep pace. Ji Yeon was where he needed her to be at each moment without being instructed. She was good at her job. By the time the car brought him back across the Han River toward the mansion in Yongsan, it was past midnight. The house was dark except for the kitchen lights, which ran on an automatic timer. He noted this distantly as something slightly unusual. Nia was a late reader, and the study lights typically burned past 1 in the morning. But he was tired in the particular way that came not from physical exertion, but from sustained performance, and he didn't pursue the thought. He poured water, loosened his tie, and went to bed. He did not check her room. They had slept separately for the better part of a year. His schedule made it impractical otherwise, he had told himself, and she had not contested it. The house was large enough that absence was easy to mistake for ordinary distance. He found out in the morning. Do-hyun woke at 6:15, showered, and went to the kitchen for coffee, the way he always did. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bay, a woman of 60 who had worked in the Kang household for 11 years and communicated exclusively through implication, was standing very still near the counter with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It took him a moment to identify it. She was frightened. "What?" he said. "Mrs. Kang's room," she said, and then said nothing else, which was more alarming than anything she could have added. He walked down the east corridor. The study door was open. He pushed it wider. The desk was cleared. Not organized. Cleared. The shelves that had held Nia's books. She had an accumulation problem. Paperbacks stacked horizontally on top of vertical rows, notebooks wedged between volumes, held about a third of what he remembered. Her laptop was gone. The framed photograph that had sat on the corner of the desk, the one from their brief stopover in Cape Town 2 years ago where she'd insisted on getting out of the car to look at the ocean, was gone. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time. Then he walked to her bedroom. The closet had been partially emptied. Not half. Not all. She'd taken specific things. He wasn't intimate enough with the details of her wardrobe to know exactly what was missing, but the gaps were conspicuous. A row of empty hangers, a shelf where shoes had been. The small jewelry box she kept on the dresser was still there. He opened it. The expensive pieces, the things he'd given her for various occasions, the diamond earrings for their first anniversary, a bracelet from a trip to Singapore, were still inside. She'd taken the simple things, a silver ring she'd had before they married, a pair of small gold studs. She left the things he gave her and took the things that were already hers. He stood with the jewelry box in his hands and understood something very precisely and immediately. This was not an emotional reaction. This had been planned. His phone began to ring. It was Director Choi, his chief of operations, calling from the office. He answered. "There's a situation," Choi Jae-min said. His voice was careful in the way it was always careful. Measured, contained, giving nothing away. "Hartman Group sent notice an hour ago. They're dissolving the partnership." Do-hyun's grip on his phone tightened slightly. Hartman Group was a German financial consortium that had been invested with the Kang organization for 4 years. The relationship represented a significant portion of the organization's legitimate international portfolio. On what grounds? The notice doesn't specify, just strategic realignment. I've put in a call to their regional director. "Keep me updated," he hung up. He went back to the study and sat in the chair that had been Nia's. It still smelled faintly of the hand lotion she used, something with citrus in it. He'd never paid enough attention to know the name. He sat there and looked at the emptied shelves and thought. His phone rang again 40 minutes later. This time it was Jisoo Young, his personal assistant. "Mr. Kang, Yamato Logistics just contacted us. Mr. Yamato is formally withdrawing from the Jeju Development Consortium. His office says," a brief pause while she checked her notes, "that he has concerns about the organization's operational reliability going forward." Do-hyun said nothing for a moment. Yamato Akira had been a partner for 6 years. The Jeju Consortium was a $300 million infrastructure project. Did he give any indication of what specifically triggered this? No, sir. His office was polite but firm. He thanked her and disconnected. Within the next 2 hours, the news arrived about Castellano Partners. Romano Castellano, a Milanese industrialist whose family had maintained a relationship with the Kang organization across 2 generations, sent a 1-paragraph communication through his attorney dissolving their current agreements and declining to renew. 3 partners. 3 different countries. 3 withdrawals within hours of each other. Do-hyun called Romano Castellano directly. It took 20 minutes to reach him, and when he did, Romano was brief in the way that people are brief when they have already made a decision and don't want to be talked out of it. "Do-hyun, I have respect for you, but this is business. Tell me what happened." A pause. "You want honesty?" "Always." Another pause, longer. "Your wife was the only reason we ever trusted you." Romano's voice carried something that might have been pity, which was worse than contempt. When she decided she was done, I had to ask myself what we were really invested in, and I realized the answer wasn't the organization. It was her judgment, her word, her presence in the room, even when we never saw her." The line was quiet for a moment. "Find her, Do-hyun, and when you do, try to deserve her this time." The call ended. Do-hyun set the phone face down on Nia's desk and sat very still. Bacon. He had met Nia Okafor 6 years ago in a conference room in New York, which was not the kind of place people described in terms of fate or electricity. It was the kind of place people described as a conference room in New York. She had been brought in as an independent mediator for a dispute between two subsidiaries of a company the Kang organization was in the process of acquiring. She was 31 then, a few years younger than him, wearing a dark blazer and natural hair pulled back simply, and she had walked into a room full of lawyers and executives who had been snarling at each other for 3 days and spent 4 hours doing something he had never quite seen before or been able to fully articulate since. She hadn't imposed anything. She'd listened. She'd asked questions that seemed almost tangential until suddenly they weren't, until suddenly both sides of the dispute were nodding at something they'd arrived at themselves without understanding how she'd guided them there. By the end of the session, the core conflict had been reframed in a way that gave both parties room to agree, and two of the lawyers who'd been borderline hostile to each other at the start were discussing specifics like colleagues. Do-hyun had requested a private meeting with her afterward. She'd agreed cautiously. He'd asked how she did what she did. She'd thought about it for a moment and then said simply, "I try to find out what people actually need instead of what they think they want. They're almost never the same thing." He'd told her that was a remarkable skill. She'd said, "It's also just paying attention." He had found that answer more interesting than almost anything anyone had said to him in years. They had met 3 more times over the following months. Always professionally, always at his instigation and her careful, measured acceptance. He was a man accustomed to being pursued. There was something almost disorienting about her complete absence of agenda. She never asked about his business, his connections, his money. She was genuinely unimpressed by all of it, not performatively unimpressed the way some people were, but actually fundamentally indifferent in a way that made him more interested in her opinion than he'd been in anyone's in years. He had proposed 14 months after their first meeting. She had said yes after thinking about it for a week, which she'd told him at the time, that she was thinking about it, and which had driven him half out of his mind. He had told himself, and believed it, that he loved her. What he hadn't understood then, and was sitting in her empty study beginning to understand now, was how little he had actually seen her. He spent the first 24 hours doing what he always did when a problem presented itself. He deployed resources. He had people who found people. He had people who traced financial movements, who mapped patterns in phone records, who could locate a specific individual in most cities in the world within 72 hours given a place to start. The problem was that Nia had anticipated this. She had not used her credit cards, not her personal ones, and not the supplementary cards on his accounts. Her phone was off and would not track. The car that had been registered to her was still in the garage. Whatever transportation she'd used to leave had left no obvious trace in any of the systems his people could access in the first day. What she had left was a trail. But it was a trail designed to be followed on her terms. The first piece surfaced when his investigator, a sharp, quiet man named Beck, who worked exclusively for the Kang organization, reported that a small climate research foundation in Seoul had received a significant anonymous donation the previous evening, time-stamped just after 10 p.m. The donation amount and the particular foundation, which dealt with air quality research in industrial zones, matched the profile of a charity Nia had mentioned to Do-hyun once, in passing, on a night he now couldn't reconstruct clearly in his memory. "She wanted you to find this," Beck said, without inflection. "I know," Do-hyun said. The donation record had been made in a way that left a partial thread, not her name, but a contact email attached to the foundation's acknowledgement system that, when traced, connected to a dormant account she had set up under her maiden name. The account itself held nothing, but the registration for it pointed to an address in Itaewon that turned out to be a small independent bookstore. He went himself. He didn't send Bayek. The bookstore was the kind of place that smelled of paper and seemed almost deliberately designed to repel people who were in a hurry. The owner, an older woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, looked at him when he came in with the specific expression shopkeepers reserve for people who are clearly in the wrong place. "I'm looking for something left for me," Do-hyun said. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she went behind the counter and retrieved a padded envelope. On the outside, in Nia's handwriting, was his name. No last name. Just Do-hyun. He He took it outside and opened it, standing on the pavement in the November cold. Inside was a single notebook. Not new, one that had clearly been used. On the first page in Nia's careful, precise handwriting. "You never asked what I did. Start at the beginning." The pages that followed were documentation. Not a journal, not a letter. Documentation. Names, dates, organizations, meeting outcomes. It took him 20 minutes of reading on the pavement, oblivious to the people moving around him, to understand what he was looking at. For the past 4 years, Nia Okafor, using only her maiden name, her pre-marriage professional reputation, and the network she had quietly continued to build while living in his house, had been operating as one of the most sought-after conflict mediators in international business. She had resolved a corporate war between 2 South Korean conglomerates whose public conflict would have destroyed 4,000 jobs and derailed a government infrastructure initiative. She had mediated a 7-party dispute in Tokyo that had been headed toward litigation that would have cost the involved parties a combined $2 billion. She had helped a Lagos-based energy company and a Dutch engineering firm find the framework for a partnership that had subsequently created the largest solar installation in West Africa. None of it had appeared in the press. None of it was attached to her married name. All of it had been done from a study in his house, in the hours after he left for work and before he returned, in the quiet that he had mistaken for nothing. He stood on the pavement in Itaewon and read until his hands were cold and the light had changed, and when he finally stopped, he was aware of something that he hadn't felt in years. Possibly since childhood, possibly never quite like this. He felt ashamed. The notebook pointed forward. Each section ended with a reference, a name, a city, a business, that connected to the next stage of a trail she had laid with the same careful, invisible precision she brought to everything. She wasn't hiding from him, she was teaching him. The first reference led to a contact in Tokyo, a woman named Yamada Reiko, who ran a conflict resolution consultancy that had retained Nia's services 3 times. Beck located an address, and Do-hyun was on a flight to Tokyo that night. Yamada Reiko received him in a spare organized office in Shinjuku. She was in her 50s, with the particular composure of someone who spent her professional life inside high-tension situations. She looked at Do-hyun for a moment when he entered, and he had the uncomfortable sense that she was assessing him the way he typically assessed rooms. "She told me you might come," Yamada said. "What did she tell you?" "That you were intelligent and that you weren't paying attention. That those 2 things had been true for some time." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." He sat. "Nia Okafor is one of the most gifted mediators I've encountered in 30 years in this field," Yamada said. "What she does is not a skill you can learn from a textbook or a training program. It's structural. It's in the way her mind works. She can hold multiple conflicting perspectives simultaneously without collapsing them into a hierarchy. She finds the space where people can agree without losing themselves." She paused. "She did 3 pieces of work for our firm. Each of them, I should tell you, happened to benefit the Kang organization indirectly. Not directly. She never disclosed the connection. She just had a tendency to ensure that when resolutions were constructed, the frameworks didn't create new vulnerabilities for the people adjacent to situations. I only understood afterward. That was her way of protecting what was yours while you didn't know it needed protecting." Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. "Why did she leave?" he said. Yamada looked at him as if the question required patience to answer charitably. "I think," she said, "you know why she left. I need to hear it. You erased her from your life in public, consistently and deliberately. You replaced her, in every room that mattered, with women who fit an aesthetic you'd decided was appropriate. You made her feel that who she was, what she looked like, how she moved through the world, was something to be corrected for." Yamada's voice was measured, not unkind, just direct. A woman can love someone and still understand that staying is slowly destroying something irreplaceable. She reached that point. The room was quiet for a moment. "She left something for you," Yamada said, and passed him a sealed envelope. The envelope contained a key and a handwritten address, not in Tokyo, in Osaka. A storage unit near Namba that Nia had apparently rented under a subsidiary name of one of the companies she'd worked with. Inside the storage unit, in a fireproof case, was something that changed the nature of everything he'd understood about the past 6 months. It was a file, physical and digital, a USB drive alongside printed documents. And what it contained was not about their marriage, not about her departure, not about any of the things he had been turning over in his mind for the past 72 hours. It was about the Kang organization. Specifically, it was about someone inside the Kang organization who had been selling information to rival structures for at least 3 years. Financial records cross-referenced with external accounts. Internal communications with timestamps that matched dates when specific proprietary information had subsequently appeared in competitor strategy. Encrypted message logs, partially decoded, linking an internal communications channel to a handler operating through a shell company in Macau. The evidence was painstakingly assembled, the kind of documentation that took months of careful, systematic work, the kind that required access to information from the inside, cross-referenced with external data sources, assembled by someone who understood both the organizational structure and the financial architecture well enough to read the gaps. Do-hyun sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit in Osaka and read through the file with the attention he had once given to the most critical business intelligence of his career. And somewhere around the third hour, he reached the section that identified the most probable source of the internal leaks. The person whose access, movement patterns, timing, and behavior aligned with the evidence trail across every data point in the file. Chairman Jae-min Kwon, his chief of operations, the man who had been at his side for 9 years, the man he trusted more completely than almost anyone living, the man who had called him the morning Nia disappeared to tell him about Hartman Group. Do-hyun sat very still on the concrete floor. Outside the storage unit, the sound of the city moved past. Trucks, voices, the occasional train in the distance. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary afternoon in a city that knew nothing about what was contained in the file he was holding. He thought about the call from Romano Castellano. Your wife was the only reason we ever trusted you. He thought about Nia, sitting in her study in their house for 4 years, quietly building the evidence that could save his empire while he was out replacing her at events she was never invited to attend. He thought about the 9 years he'd sat across a desk from Jae-min Kwon and trusted the man's careful, contained voice and read it as loyalty. He thought about all the things he had not paid attention to. His phone buzzed, a message from Beck. Trail continues, Los Angeles connection, one more stop before she settled. Do-hyun put the file back in the fireproof case. He stood up. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of a man who had built an empire and, it was becoming clear, had been too occupied building it to notice what was holding it together. He closed the storage unit, locked it, and walked back toward the train station. The trail was still going, and somewhere at the end of it, in a city he hadn't been to in years, was the woman he had spent 2 years making invisible. He needed to find her. He needed to find her before Jae-min Kwon understood that the evidence she'd collected had just found its way into the hands of the one person who could do something about it. He walked faster. The flight from Osaka to Los Angeles took 11 hours. Do-hyun spent most of it in his seat with the USB drive in his jacket pocket and the fireproof case stowed above him, reading through the digital copy of Nia's file on a laptop he'd bought with cash at Kansai Airport. He read it the way he read financial reports during acquisitions, methodically, without allowing the emotional register to interfere with the analytical one. He made notes. He cross-referenced dates. By the time the California coastline appeared below the cloud cover, he had a complete picture. Jae-min Kwon had been leaking operational intelligence to a rival structure, a loose consortium operating primarily out of Macau and Hong Kong, for approximately 3 years and 2 months. The leaks had been surgical. Nothing catastrophic enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but consistent enough to give the rival consortium advance intelligence on Kang organization movements in international markets, allowing them to position themselves advantageously on several significant deals. The losses to the Kang organization were, by Do-hyun's calculation, somewhere between $40 and $60 million across that period, substantial, but distributed across enough transactions that no single incident had flagged as a pattern. Nia had seen the pattern. He didn't know yet how she had accessed the information she'd needed. That was a question for later. Right now, he needed to know where she was, and he needed to reach her before Kwon, who would eventually notice that the archive in Osaka was no longer only Nia's secret, understood the exposure he was facing. Beck had sent a follow-up while Do-hyun was in the air. The Los Angeles Connection was a conflict resolution organization based in Culver City, a nonprofit that Nia had done a significant piece of pro bono work for 2 years prior. The organization's director, a woman named Patricia Obese, had been a professional contact of Nia's for years. Beck had a last known address for Patricia Obese and a confirmation that she and Nia had been in contact as recently as 6 weeks ago. Do Hyun cleared customs at LAX, found a car, and drove to Culver City. Patricia Obese turned out to be a broad-shouldered Ghanaian-American woman in her early 60s who answered her own door and looked at Do Hyun on her front step with an expression of complete and undisguised assessment. "You're the husband," she said. "Yes." "She described you accurately." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Inside was a modest, dense house, bookshelves on every wall, a large table covered with papers and folders, the kind of organized chaos that signaled a mind that worked in multiple directions simultaneously. Patricia Obese gestured toward the kitchen table, cleared a space, and sat across from him with a cup of tea she didn't offer to replicate. "She's not here," she said. "You know that already, or you wouldn't look as steady as you do." "I know. I'm following the trail she left." Patricia looked at him. "You've seen the file." "In Osaka?" "Yes." "Then you know what you're dealing with on the organizational side." "I know enough." Patricia wrapped both hands around her tea mug. "She found the first anomaly 18 months ago. She told me about it in pieces over the following months. Never the full picture, I think because she was still building it. What she described was a woman trying to understand the scope of a betrayal, while living in the same house as the man being betrayed and not being able to tell him because she understood clearly and without bitterness that he wouldn't believe her over the person doing the betraying. Do Hyun said nothing. "She wasn't wrong about that, was she?" Patricia said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "She wasn't." Patricia nodded slowly. "She's in New Mexico, Santa Fe. She's been there for 5 weeks." She paused. "She told me that if you came this far, if you actually followed the whole trail, I should give you this." She got up, went to her drawer in the kitchen counter, and returned with an envelope. This one, unlike the others, had no writing on the outside. He opened it. Inside was a single index card. In Nia's handwriting, "If you've made it here, you already know more about me than you did when I left. The question is what you're going to do with it. Come to Santa Fe when you're ready to answer that question honestly. Not before." Below that, an address. Do Hyun sat with the index card in his hands for a long moment. "She's rebuilding herself out there," Patricia said, not unkindly. "Whatever you do next, make sure it's about her, not about you needing to fix what's broken so you can feel better." He folded the card and put it in his pocket. "One more thing," Patricia said. "The organizational situation, the file. She built that evidence at considerable personal risk, and she did it knowing she might never get to use it. She did it because she didn't want the people who worked honestly inside your organization to lose their livelihoods because of a traitor." She looked at him steadily. "That is the kind of person you replaced with women who photographed well at galas." He stood up. He thanked her. He walked back to the car. He sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine, looking at the afternoon light on the unfamiliar street. Then he took out his phone and called Beck. "I need everything on Kwan's movements and communications for the past 96 hours, he said, quietly. "Nothing that triggers any internal systems. Use only external resources." "Understood," Beck said. "And the other matter?" "I'm going to Santa Fe." A brief pause. "Do you want backup?" "No." He started the car and pulled into traffic and drove toward the freeway, and somewhere in the forward movement of it, the city sliding past, the distance still ahead, something in his chest settled into a different register than the controlled, managed tension that had been his default state for as long as he could remember. It felt, uncomfortably, like the approach of something honest. Plus, Beck's report reached him at a motel outside Albuquerque, where he'd stopped for a few hours before making the final drive to Santa Fe. He read it in the parking lot, engine off, the New Mexico night cold and very clear above him. Kwan had been unusually active in the past week. 3 calls to a number in Macau, a discretionary transfer of funds from an organizational account to a routing structure that Bayek flagged as inconsistent with standard operational patterns. Most significantly, 2 calls to the Kang organization's internal security team, made on the pretext of reviewing protocols, which Beck had cross-referenced against the access logs for certain internal archive systems. Quan was checking whether certain files had been accessed. Specifically, certain files that had nothing to do with the protocols he was ostensibly reviewing. He was covering ground. He didn't know yet that the real evidence wasn't in the organization's systems. He didn't know that Naya had assembled it externally, meticulously, from the outside in. But he would eventually understand that her departure and the shifting landscape of international partnerships were connected, and when he did, the calculus would change. Do-hyun sat in the parking lot and thought about 9 years. The shape of a working relationship that had looked like loyalty from one side and had been, from the other, a long and careful exploitation. He thought about the particular quality of Kwan's voice on the phone the morning Nia disappeared, that careful, measured control. The immediate business of Hartman Group, introduced efficiently, professionally. At the time, Do-hyun had read it as competence. Now he read it differently. Kwan had called first thing, before Do-hyun had even discovered Nia was gone. The Hartman News, Oshri, the first public signal of the partnership collapse, had arrived through Kwan's channel, framed by Kwan's words, given Kwan's particular spin. He was either managing the fallout, or he had triggered it. Do-hyun drove to Santa Fe in the early morning and arrived as the high desert light was just beginning to define the edges of things. The address Patricia had given him led to a quiet street of low adobe houses, the walls the color of the land they rose from, morning shadow pooling in the doorways. He found the house. He sat outside it for a moment. Then he got out of the car and walked to the door and knocked. The woman who opened it was not the person he remembered. She was wearing a loose linen shirt, her natural hair in 2 loose buns, glasses he didn't recognize on her face. She looked, and this was the word that arrived before any other, simple and precise and slightly painful, rested. The specific exhaustion that had lived around her eyes and soul, the one he had noticed only occasionally and never interrogated, was gone. She looked at him. Her expression was not angry, not cold, not warm. It was the expression of someone who had prepared for this moment and was holding themselves carefully at the threshold of it. "You found the storage unit," she said. "Osaka." "Yes." She stepped back from the door without saying more, which he took as permission to enter. The inside of the house was small and honest. A desk near the window covered with papers. A wall of books that was already beginning to develop the organized overflow he recognized. A kitchen that smelled of coffee. She brought 2 cups without asking and sat across from him at a small wooden table, and they regarded each other in silence for a moment. "How much of the file did you read?" she said. "All of it." She nodded once. "Kwan," he said. "Kwan," she confirmed. "How did you get access to the financial data, the cross-referenced records?" She held the coffee mug with both hands. "You know that I maintain professional relationships under my name, my own name. I know that now. Several of those relationships involved financial intelligence work, structural analysis of corporate dispute patterns. When I started noticing anomalies in the public-facing side of certain Kang organization transactions, the kind of anomalies that only appear if you're looking from outside and you understand what the inside structure should look like, I started mapping them. It took 8 months to build the evidential picture from external data alone. A pause. Then I used the access I still had to internal household accounts. Not operational accounts, but the kinds of records that get linked at the administrative level, to triangulate timing. I never accessed operational files directly. Everything in that archive is built from data I had legal access to. You protected yourself legally. I protected the evidence legally, so it holds. He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said, and heard as he said it the particular inadequacy of the question. She didn't answer immediately. She turned the mug slowly in her hands. "Do-hyun," she said, "you brought 4 different women to events in the past 10 months. I know their names. I know which ones you used for which occasions based on the image profile of the event. I know this because I paid attention to your schedule the way I paid attention to everything connected to you, carefully, completely, in a direction that was not reciprocated." She met his eyes. "If I had come to you with evidence against Jaemin Kwan, Who do you think you would have believed? The room was quiet. Him, Do-hyun said. Yes, she said. Him, because you saw him. He was in the rooms with you. He had the right look and the right manner, and he'd been at your side for 9 years. I was the woman you hid in the house because I didn't photograph correctly for your social calendar. She said it without bitterness. Flat, factual, more painful for both qualities. You would have told me I misunderstood. You would have managed me, and Kwon would have known I was looking, and everything I'd built would have been destroyed. Do-hyun said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be sufficient. So I finished building it, she said, and then I left it somewhere you would find it when you were actually ready to look. He put his hands flat on the table. I need to move on Kwon now, he said. He's covering ground. He's checking internal systems, trying to locate whatever evidence might exist. When he doesn't find it internally, he'll start looking externally. And when he starts looking externally, he'll realize the exposure is worse than he calculated, she said. And a man in that position, with those connections, becomes unpredictable. She nodded slowly. She already knew this. She'd known it before she left. She'd built the trail the way she'd built it. The clues, the cities, the pacing, not only to make him understand her, but to time his arrival with the evidence to a window when it could still be used. There are 3 people in my international network, she said, who have the legal reach and the institutional credibility to receive this evidence and initiate formal proceedings through channels that Kwon's connections can't interfere with. I've already been in contact with 2 of them. She met his eyes. I've been waiting for you to get here before I confirm the 3rd. The weight of that sat between them for a moment. She had not just left. She had not just exposed the betrayal. She had built the entire architecture of the response, positioned all the pieces, and then waited, in this small, quiet house in a desert city, for him to arrive at the moment she'd calculated he would arrive, if he was ever going to arrive at all. You planned this, he said. Not an accusation, almost something else. I planned the contingency, she said. The contingency where you followed the trail and arrived here in time. There was another contingency. What was the other contingency? She looked at him steadily. The one where you didn't come. The morning light through the window was full now, reaching across the table between them. Do-hyun sat with his hands flat on the wood and thought about that version of events. The one where he had not followed, had not read, had not arrived. He thought about what Nia would have done then, alone, with the file and the 3 contacts and the architecture she'd built. She would have done it anyway, without him. She had built it so it could function either way. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a fraction less distance. First, she said, we call my contact in Geneva. Then we call Beck. Beck? Your investigator. I know who he is. I've known for 2 years. The faintest edge of something that might have been humor in her voice. He's good. We'll need him for the document chain. Do-hyun looked at her for a moment. You knew about Beck, he said. I knew about most things, she said simply. You just didn't know I knew. She reached for her phone on the table, and somewhere outside the window, the New Mexico morning moved on without any awareness of the fact that inside this small adobe house, the man who controlled one of Seoul's largest criminal financial empires and the woman who had spent 4 years quietly holding it together were finally, for the first time, sitting at the same table and working from the same information. The call to Geneva lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, the formal evidence chain was in motion, a process that, once initiated through the channels Nia's contact commanded, could not be quietly buried by anyone operating through Macau shell companies or internal organizational pressure. When she hung up, she set the phone down and looked at him. Kwon will know within 24 to 48 hours that something's moving, she said. When he does, he'll either run or he'll try to manage it from inside. If he tries to manage it from inside, he'll need to neutralize the source of the evidence, Do-hyun said. Which he believes is still only me, she said. He doesn't know you have the file. They looked at each other. He knows where you are, Do-hyun said. It wasn't a question. Her expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders told him she'd been sitting with that knowledge for longer than this conversation had been running. He's had someone watching this address for 11 days, she said. The words landed in the room like something physical. Do-hyun was on his feet before he fully processed the decision to stand. He moved to the window, not in front of it, to the side, the ingrained instinct of a man who had spent his adult life in environments where windows were liabilities, and scanned the street without moving the curtain. The street looked quiet. Adobe walls, morning shadow, a truck parked 2 houses down that had been there when he arrived. "The truck," he said. "Blue Chevy." "Yes." Her voice was steady. "It changes every 3 days, different vehicle, same position. I noticed the pattern on day 4. He turned from the window. "You've been sitting here for 11 days knowing you were being watched." "I've been sitting here for 11 days finishing the evidence chain and waiting for you to arrive." She met his eyes without flinching. "I calculated the watch would stay passive as long as Kwon believed he still had time to assess the situation. The moment anything moved, the moment the Geneva call went through." "Yes." Do-hyun crossed back to the table. "How long ago did that call end?" She checked her phone. 53 minutes. He pulled out his own phone and called Beck. Beck answered on the second ring. "The Macau number Kwon called 3 times this week," Do-hyun said. "I need to know if there's been any outbound communication from that number in the last 2 hours. One moment. The sound of keys. A pause that lasted long enough to feel. "Yes. 41 minutes ago. Outbound to a U.S. number, New Mexico area code." Do-hyun looked at Nia. "We need to move," he said. "Now." She was already standing. She moved without panic, which told him she'd rehearsed this contingency too. She went to the bedroom and came back in under 2 minutes with a bag already packed. Not overpacked, not frantic, the bag of someone who had thought carefully about what mattered and what didn't. She shut her laptop, removed the hard drive, pocketed it. She picked up 2 notebooks from the desk and left the rest. "My car's in the back," she said. "They won't have eyes on the rear alley unless they repositioned overnight." "They repositioned," Do-hyun said. He'd seen it from the window. The truck was too perfectly positioned not to have an angle on the side approach, which meant if there was a second vehicle, it was covering the rear. "We take mine, front, directly past them." She looked at him. "They're watching for a movement," he said. "A quiet departure looks like running. We walk out the front door like 2 people going to get breakfast. And when they follow. Beck is 20 minutes out. I called him before the Geneva call ended." He held her gaze. "I planned contingencies too." Something moved in her expression. Not quite surprised, not quite not surprised. They walked out the front door at a pace that communicated nothing. The New Mexico morning was cold and clean, the light still low. Do-hyun kept his hands visible and his stride unhurried. Nia walked beside him, close but not pressed against him, her bag over one shoulder, her eyes forward. He did not look at the blue truck. Looking was confirmation. Instead, he watched the edges of his peripheral vision and registered the slight adjustment of weight inside the vehicle. Someone shifting. Someone picking up a phone. They reached his rental car. He unlocked it without rushing. They got in. He drove at exactly the speed limit toward the center of the city. "They're behind us," Nia said. She was watching the side mirror, not turning her head. "One vehicle. One that I can see." He nodded. He took the route toward the main commercial district, visible, populated, the kind of environment that complicated any aggressive action. His phone buzzed on the console. "Bayek, I have a visual on your position," Beck said. "Single tail, gray sedan, 2 occupants. I'm coming in from the north." "The driver," Do-hyun said, "is he Kwon's direct asset or Macau contracted?" "Macau number connected to a local contracted operator based in Albuquerque. Private security, not organizational." That was the only piece of information in the last hour that had been slightly better than expected. Contracted private security meant capable but constrained, not the kind of asset that would escalate to something irreversible without explicit authorization, and that authorization took time, and time was currently the only resource they had. "I need 40 minutes to get Nia to the location in the file," Do-hyun said. "I can give you 35, Beck said, and disconnected. Do-hyun turned onto a wide boulevard and pressed the accelerator. Nia was watching him. Not the mirror anymore. Him. "What location?" she said. The second contingency, he said. The one you built for if I didn't come. A silence. How do you know about that? She said. Because I read the entire file, he said. Not just the evidence against Quan, the structural notes in the back section, the ones in the smaller handwriting. He glanced at her. You documented the response architecture both ways. If I came, the plan activated with 2 actors. If I didn't, you had a safe house contact in Albuquerque with a direct channel to the Geneva office and a protocol for submitting the evidence independently. She was quiet for a moment. You read my handwriting in a storage unit in Osaka, she said. I read everything you left me, he said. You left it to be read. Another silence, shorter. The contact in Albuquerque, she said. Marcus Webb. He worked a 3-party mediation with me in Dubai 18 months ago. He'll have the space and the secure line. I know, I already texted him your name. He's expecting us. She turned back to the mirror. The gray sedan was still there, 3 cars back, steady. Quan's going to know the Geneva process is irreversible within the hour, she said. He already suspects it. When he confirms it, the contracted asset becomes insufficient. He'll escalate to organizational resources. Yes, which means we have a window. We have a window, he agreed. He drove. Marcus Webb turned out to be a large, unhurried man in his late 40s who lived in a craftsman house in a quiet Albuquerque neighborhood and opened the door before they knocked, which meant he'd been watching for them. He looked at Nia with the particular warmth of professional respect and at Do Hyun with the particular caution of a man who understood exactly who he was looking at. You vouching for him, Marcus said to Nia. Provisionally, she said. Marcus stepped back. Come in. Beck had peeled off the gray sedan 3 blocks back. Do Hyun didn't know exactly how, and didn't ask, because Beck was the kind of professional whose methods worked best without oversight. What mattered was that when Do Hyun checked the mirror on the final approach to Marcus's street, no one was behind them. The safe room was a converted study at the back of the house. Reinforced door, signal-blocking material in the walls. The kind of setup that said Marcus Webb had done sensitive work in environments where paranoia was the rational default. A secure terminal sat on a desk beside a printer and a row of external drives. Nia sat down at the terminal and began working. Do Hyun stood near the door and watched her. She was different here than she had been anywhere he'd observed her. Even in the quiet of her own study in Seoul, even in the careful conversations he was now replaying in his memory with better information than he'd had when they occurred. Here, with the work directly in front of her, she was entirely without the peripheral self-consciousness he'd occasionally glimpsed when she stood beside him in social contexts where she knew she was being assessed and found decoratively insufficient. She was, without any ambiguity, completely herself. He had done that to her. The self-consciousness. He had installed it by his choices, one event at a time, over 2 years. Marcus brought coffee and set a cup near her without interrupting her focus. He looked at Do Hyun. Hell of a wife, Marcus said quietly. Yes, Do Hyun said. You know what she turned down to build what she built. Do Hyun looked at him. 3 separate full-time offers in the years since you married her, Marcus said. 2 from international firms. 1 from a government-adjacent body in Brussels that would have put her on a retainer I can't quote you a number for because I don't actually know the ceiling. He picked up his own coffee. She turned them all down. Said she had a situation at home she wasn't finished with. He paused. I used to think she meant the marriage. Now I think she meant Quan. She meant both, Do Hyun said. Marcus nodded slowly. Nia's voice came from the terminal without her turning around. The secondary evidence package is uploading to Geneva now. Completion in 7 minutes. When it lands, the formal process locks. No single party can halt it, and Quan's legal exposure becomes a matter of institutional record across 3 jurisdictions. Vos que país? Pues, she paused. At that point, his only viable move is voluntary surrender to the process or flight. Flight terminates his viability as an operator permanently. His network dissolves without his credibility. He won't accept either option immediately, Do Hyun said. He'll spend 12 to 18 hours trying to find a third option. There isn't one. He doesn't know that yet. She turned in the chair and looked at him. What does he do in those 12 to 18 hours? Do Hyun had been thinking about this since Osaka. Jae-min Kwon was not a man who panicked. He was a man who assessed situations with cold precision and acted with surgical efficiency. Those qualities had made him effective for 9 years. They also meant that when he identified a threat, he moved directly toward the source. He comes for the evidence, Do-hyun said. He'll believe there's still a physical component that hasn't been submitted, something that can be intercepted. The fireproof case from Osaka, Nia said. You left a copy of the file structure in the archive without the USB drive. He'll find it when he searches the unit, and he will search it. He'll know the original drive exists. He'll know whoever has it is either here or moving toward a submission point. Nia was very still for a moment. He'll come to New Mexico, she said. He's probably already in the air. The 7 minutes elapsed. The terminal signaled completion. Nia looked at the screen, then back at Do-hyun. It's done, she said. The formal process is locked. Good, he said. Then we need to be somewhere that isn't here in the next 2 hours. Marcus was already on his feet. I have a property outside the city. Off the primary grid, you'll have communications, transport, and security. Do-hyun shook his head. Kwon will have assets capable of finding a secondary property if he has enough time. I need something that doesn't exist in any database connected to anyone in this room. Silence. Then Nia said, I know a place. Both men looked at her. A client, she said, from a mediation 3 years ago. A family dispute over a ranch property 60 kilometers north. They gave me an open invitation. The kind that people mean when they say it because I did work that saved their family legacy. She paused. No connection to Marcus, no connection to the Kang organization, no connection to anything Kwon can map. Can you reach them now? Do-hyun said. She was already picking up her phone. It was the efficiency of it that got to him. The absolute, unsentimentalized pragmatism. She was operating in the aftermath of the most significant confrontation of their shared life with the same systematic precision she applied to everything. No drama, no paralysis, no waiting for someone else to provide a solution. She had already built the solution. She'd built 3 of them. She was reaching for the 4th. He thought about the word Romano Castellano had used. Trusted. Not liked, not respected, though both were presumably true. Trusted. The specific weight of that word, the thing it named, the confidence that a person would see the situation clearly and act in accordance with what was actually true rather than what was convenient. He had not, in 2 years of marriage, trusted her with a single significant decision. Not because she wasn't capable, because he had never looked long enough to know what she was capable of. She finished the call. We can go. They're expecting us. Chugged. The ranch was 60 kilometers north and 3 kilometers off the main road, accessed by a track that the rental car managed badly, and that Do-hyun drove in silence. Nia beside him, Marcus staying behind to manage the Albuquerque end of the evidence chain. The high desert opened around them as they climbed, scrub and rock and enormous sky, the kind of landscape that reduced things to their actual scale. Halfway up the track, Nia said, Beck. He'll meet us at the property by nightfall. And the organizational side, your people in Seoul, the ones who aren't Kwon. I have 3 direct reports who are clean. I've had Beck running parallel surveillance on their activity patterns for the past 48 hours to confirm. When I call them, they'll move on Kwon's operational infrastructure inside the organization before he can activate it from outside. You've been building the countermove since Osaka. Since the plane from Tokyo, he said. I had 11 hours. She looked at the road ahead. The employees, she said. The ones Kwon's been using as unwitting channels, people who process transactions without knowing what they were actually part of. They need protection in the formal record. Your Geneva contact already has the personnel list. It was in the secondary package. I put it there 2 months ago, she said, when I first confirmed the scope. He glanced at her. You did this 2 months ago, he said. I did most of it 2 months ago, she said. I was waiting to leave until the evidence was complete enough that the formal process could protect them without me having to remain available as a witness. You waited to protect the employees before you left. Yes. The words sat in the cab of the car between them, simple and unremarkable, and for some reason it was this. More than Romano's words, more than the empty study, more than the notebooks and the cities and the storage unit in Osaka, that moved something in Do-hyun that he didn't have a clean name for. He drove. The ranch house appeared at the top of the track as the morning moved toward noon. Low, solid, built for the landscape rather than against it. An older man was waiting outside. He looked at Nia when she got out of the car with the expression of someone greeting a person they genuinely owed something to. "Ms. Okafor," he said, "you're safe here." "Thank you, Mr. Reyes," she said. "I'm sorry for the imposition." "Not an imposition." He looked at Do-hyun without animosity, but without warmth either. Then back at Nia. "Your rooms are ready. I'll have someone watch the road." They went inside. The room they were given was spare and clean. 2 chairs, a table, a window facing north toward open land. Nia set her bag on the table and stood at the window and looked at the view for a moment. Do-hyun stood near the door. "We have somewhere between 8 and 16 hours before Kwon locates a vector toward us," he said. "After that, Beck and the Seoul team need to have moved." "They will have moved," she said, still looking at the window. "Naya." She turned. He stood in the doorway of the spare room in a ranch house 60 kilometers north of Albuquerque and looked at his wife, really looked at her, in the way that he was only now beginning to understand he had almost never done, and said the thing that had been accumulating since the bookstore in Itaewon. "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make adequate," he said, "and I'm aware that saying that is still primarily about my discomfort rather than your experience, which is the same failure I've been making for 2 years. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything right now," he said. "I'm telling you that I know what I did, not approximately, specifically. I know which events, I know which choices, I know the calculation I made, which was that the appearance of success was more important than the person I married, and I know that calculation was wrong, and I know the cost of it." She held his gaze and said nothing. "That's all," he said. "We have work to do. I wanted to say that before we did it." She was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "Make the calls to Seoul." He nodded. He took out his phone. And that was the moment it arrived. Not as a dramatic intrusion, not as something he should have anticipated but somehow hadn't, not as anything other than a simple notification on his screen from a number he recognized as one of the 3 clean direct reports in Seoul. He read the message. He read it again. His hand, holding the phone, was very still. "What is it?" Nia said. She had seen his face change. He looked up at her. "Kwon didn't get on a plane to New Mexico," he said. "What?" "He went to Seoul." Do-hyun's voice was flat in the way that happened when the thing underneath the flatness was too large for any other register. "He called an emergency board session 40 minutes ago. He's presenting the Kang organization's board with a formal motion, documentation that positions him as the acting director in the event of the chairman's incapacitation or absence." Nia stared at him. "He's not running from the evidence," Do-hyun said. "He's using the window, the time between the Geneva submission and the formal proceedings becoming active, to take the organization from the inside." He looked at the message again. "He's not trying to destroy the evidence. He's trying to make himself the chairman before the evidence lands, so that when it does, he controls the organizational response to it." The room was very quiet. "If he achieves board confirmation," Nia started, "the formal proceedings become a negotiation between institutions and the Kang organization, and the Kang organization at that point is Jae-min Kwon." He put the phone down. "He played me. He saw the evidence chain moving and he moved laterally, not toward the evidence, toward the seat." Nia sat down in one of the chairs. "Your 3 clean direct reports," she said. "They're in that board meeting." "Yes." "Will they hold? Against Kwon's documentation? Without me present?" He was already calculating. "For a session, not indefinitely." "How long to get to Seoul?" "Direct flight from Albuquerque to LAX, then Seoul. 16 hours minimum." She looked at him. "The board session," she said. "When does it conclude?" "Standard emergency session, 6 hours." They looked at each other across the spare room in the ranch house, 60 kilometers from Albuquerque, with the New Mexico land enormous and indifferent outside the window, and the arithmetic of the situation settled between them like something solid and immovable. 16 hours to Seoul. 6 hours until the board session concluded. And Jae-min Kwon, the man Do-hyun had trusted for 9 years, sitting in a boardroom in Seoul right now, reading documents he had prepared for exactly this contingency. preparing to take everything Do-hyun had built before the man who built it could get back to stop him. Do-hyun stood up. "I'm not flying to Seoul," he said. Nia looked at him. "The board session is 6 hours," he said. "I cannot be in that room in 6 hours. So I don't fight the board session." He was moving now, phone back in hand, already pulling up a contact. "I fight what happens after." "Explain." Kwon needs board confirmation to establish himself as acting director. That confirmation, under the Kang organization's charter, requires a formal instrument filed with the commercial registry. That filing takes time, a minimum of 72 hours to process even on an expedited basis. He looked at her. "I don't need to stop the vote. I need to ensure that in the 72 hours between the vote and the filing, the Geneva proceedings generate enough institutional weight that no commercial registry in Korea will process a directorship transfer that places a formally accused party in control of the organization." Long. Nia was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, working it. "Your Geneva contact," he said. "Can they accelerate the formal notification to Korean regulatory bodies?" "Not unilaterally," she said, "but I know someone who can apply pressure to that timeline." She was already on her feet. "Give me 10 minutes." She went to the other end of the room and made a call. Do-hyun made his own calls, 3 in rapid succession to Seoul, his clean direct reports, precise and fast, telling them what they needed to know and what they needed to do, which was to delay, stall, introduce procedural objections to every step of Kwon's board motion, buy hours without appearing to buy hours. Min Seok, his most senior clean report, said, "He has documentation, sir. It's thorough. It's fabricated. I know that, but the board doesn't, not yet." "How many members does he have?" A pause. "Enough to pass the motion if no one challenges the documentation directly." "Challenge it. Question the provenance of every document. Invoke the charter clause requiring a 24-hour review period before any emergency directorship motion can be finalized." He'll argue that clause doesn't apply under the emergency provision. Let him argue. Every minute he's arguing is a minute the Geneva timeline is advancing. Do-hyun's voice was flat and precise, the way it got when everything that wasn't essential had been stripped away. "You're not trying to win the argument. You're trying to consume the clock. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Don't let him close the session before 6 hours, whatever it takes." He hung up. Nia was still on her phone. Her voice was low and rapid and in English, the kind of English she used in professional contexts, which was different from the English she used with him, more compressed, more precise, carrying the weight of institutional credibility that he was only now fully mapping. He watched her for a moment, the way she held herself when she was working, the absence of doubt in her posture. She finished the call. "My contact in Brussels," she said. "She's activating a formal notification to the Korean Financial Services Commission. It's not a full proceedings notice, that takes longer, but it's a regulatory flag on any major ownership or directorship transaction involving the Kang organization. Any commercial registry receiving a filing will see that flag and be required to pause processing pending clarification." "How long to activate?" 2 hours for the flag, another hour to propagate through the registry system. "Kwon's board session ends in 6 hours, Do-hyun said. "The flag will be active in 3. Even if he wins the vote, the filing freezes." "Yes." They looked at each other. "That's the window," he said. "That's the window," she agreed. Outside, the New Mexico afternoon was moving. The light had changed since morning, harder now, the shadows sharper. Somewhere down the track toward the road, one of Reyes's people was watching the approach. Beck was still 4 hours out. Do-hyun sat down and looked at his hands and let himself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the full weight of the situation. The distance, the clock, the man in a boardroom in Seoul who had sat across desks from him for 9 years with a patient, carefully maintained lie. He let himself feel the particular nausea of that, the specific quality of being betrayed by someone you had trusted, not just professionally, but in the deeper way that came from proximity and consistency over years. Then he put it down. There would be time for that later. Right now there was only the work. "The employees," he said, "the ones Kwon used as channels. If the regulatory flag delays the filing and the Geneva proceedings activate fully, what's their exposure in the interim?" "Protected," she said. The personnel file I submitted documented their transactions as unwitting. The formal record treats them as witnesses, not participants. And if Quan tries to use them as leverage, names them as knowing participants to create confusion in the proceedings. She met his eyes. I documented against that specifically. Cross-referenced transaction timing with communication records that establish they couldn't have known. The documentation is designed to be Quan-proof. A pause. I anticipated that he would try to use them. When did you anticipate that? 4 months ago, she said. When I understood the full scope of what he'd built. A man who operates the way he operated for 3 years doesn't just run when he's exposed. He tries to take people down with him. It's the mechanism of the thing. She said it the way she said most things, factually, without performance. I built the protection before I built the prosecution. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. How? He said. How do you do that? She looked at him. Do what? She said. Hold all of it, he said. The evidence, the contingencies, the personnel protection, the timing, the response architecture, all of it simultaneously, for months, without anyone knowing. She considered the question, not as if it were flattery. She didn't process flattery particularly, he was learning, but as if it deserved a genuine answer. I pay attention, she said. It was the same answer she had given him in New York years ago when he'd asked how she did what she did in that conference room. And I don't decide in advance what's important and what isn't. I let the information tell me. He said nothing. You decide in advance what's important, she said. Not unkindly. Most people in your position do. It's efficient. It's also how you miss things. I missed you, he said. Yes, she said. You did. The room held that. 3 hours passed in the disciplined tension of people doing precise work under pressure. Nia managed the Brussels to Geneva communication chain from Marcus's secured laptop, which she'd brought in her bag. Do-hyun worked the phone. Seoul, Baek, 2 of his international legal contacts in Hong Kong who had the right jurisdictional relationships to accelerate certain filings. Neither of them talked unnecessarily. Reyes brought food at some point. Neither of them ate much. At hour 3, the regulatory flag confirmed active. At hour 4, Min-suk called from Seoul. The session is still running, Min-suk said. His voice was strained at the edges in a way that told Do-hyun the last 4 hours had cost him. He's getting frustrated with the delays. He knows something is slowing him down, but he can't identify what. How many board members is he holding? 7 out of 11. He needs 8 for the emergency provision. He needs 1 more. Director Park Sung-joon is undecided. Kwon has been working him directly for the last 90 minutes. Do-hyun felt something cold and specific move through him. Park Sung-joon, the venture capital director from the gala. The man he'd cut off mid-pitch and told to send numbers to Director Choi. The man whose presentation he hadn't actually listened to. Put me through to Park Sung-joon, he said. Directly. Now. A pause on the line, shuffling, low voices. Then, Mr. Kang. Park Sung-joon's voice, careful and surprised. Director Park, Do-hyun said, I'm going to be direct with you. Mr. Kang, The documentation Kwon presented today is fabricated. I know what it contains because I know what it was designed to counter. The organizational evidence supporting his motion will not survive contact with formal regulatory review, which is currently in process across 3 jurisdictions. He paused. Your vote today will be on the public record. Every decision you make in the next 20 minutes will be examined in detail by the institutions managing that review. Silence. Director Park, Do-hyun said, I told you to send your Busan proposal to Director Choi. I was dismissive. I was wrong to be. He kept his voice even. When this is resolved, I will review your proposal personally. You have my word. A pause. But I need you to hold your vote. Another silence. Longer. I'm going to request a procedural recess, Park Sung-joon said carefully. How long? I can reasonably request 2 hours on grounds of documentation review. 2 hours is enough, Do-hyun said. He hung up. Nia was watching him from across the table. She had heard the conversation. The room was small enough. You made him a promise, she said. I made him a fair offer, Do-hyun said. His proposal may genuinely be worth reviewing. Maybe. Maybe, he agreed. Something very faint moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. Wolves. Beck arrived at the ranch as the sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline. A lean, gray-haired man who moved through the Reyes property with the unhurried assurance of someone whose entire professional existence involved being prepared for environments that weren't his own. He nodded at Naya with the specific respect of a man who had been researching someone for days and had formed a clear opinion. He looked at Do-hyun and waited. "Kwon," Do-hyun said. "He's still in the board session," Beck said. "Park Sung-jun's recess request bought 2 hours and 20 minutes. The session resumes in 45 minutes. The filing flag. Active and confirmed. 3 commercial registry offices in Seoul have the notification. A 4th in Busan." Beck set a tablet on the table. His Macau contact went dark 4 hours ago. Either he's been instructed to cease communication or he identified the surveillance and pulled back. If the Macau contact pulls back, Kwon is operating without his external support structure, Do-hyun said. "He's been isolated," Naya said. She was reading the tablet. "The contracted asset in Albuquerque, the gray sedan. What happened to them?" "Managed," Beck said. He did not elaborate. "Is anyone hurt?" she said. Beck looked at her for a moment. "No." She nodded and went back to the tablet. Do-hyun watched this exchange and understood something specific. Nia was not naive about the nature of the organization she had married into. She had never been naive about it. She'd asked whether anyone was hurt not because she expected violence to be absent from Beck's methods, but because she was tracking consequences, the way she tracked everything. She had always understood exactly where she lived. She had simply chosen, persistently and without illusion, to build something in that space that moved toward less damage rather than more. He had called that shyness. He had called it not fitting the image. He had been spectacularly wrong about what he was looking at. "The board session reconvenes in 40 minutes, Do-hyun said. "When it does, Kwon will push for immediate finalization. He'll know the delay was engineered, and he'll move fast to close before anything else can interrupt the process." "Park Sung-jun won't vote with him," Nia said. "Not after that call. That leaves him at 7. He needs 8. He'll try to flip one of my 3. Beck said, "Lee Dong-wook. Of your 3 clean votes, he's the most susceptible. He has a son with significant personal debt. Kwon has known about that for at least a year. It appears in his communication patterns with the Macau contact." Do-hyun stood very still. "He prepared leverage against my own board members," he said. "Yes." "How long has he had it?" "The communication pattern establishing the debt information dates to 14 months ago." 14 months, before Nia had started building the evidence archive. Kwon had been preparing a takeover contingency for over a year, running it in parallel with his daily operational role, sitting across from Do-hyun in meeting after meeting with the patience of a man who was playing a game no one else knew was happening. "Call Lee Dong-wook," Nia said. Do-hyun looked at her. "Now," she said, "before the session reconvenes, don't let Kwon get to him first." He called Lee Dong-wook. The call connected in 2 rings. "Mr. Kang." Lee Dong-wook's voice had a quality that Do-hyun recognized immediately, the particular tension of a man who had already been in a difficult conversation. "Kwon contacted you," Do-hyun said. A pause. "During the recess." "Yes." "What did he offer?" Another pause. "He didn't offer anything. He reminded me of certain information and indicated that his position going forward would affect how that information was managed." Leverage, clean, direct. "Your son's debt," Do-hyun said. Silence. "Dong-wook," Do-hyun said. "Listen to me carefully. Kwon's position going forward is not going to be chairman of this organization. It's going to be the subject of a formal multi-jurisdictional investigation. Any leverage he holds dissolves with his credibility." A pause. "I'm aware of your son's situation. That's not a threat. I want to be clear. I'm telling you so you understand that Kwon's threat is built on a foundation that is currently collapsing under him." Lee Dong-wook's breathing was audible on the line. "If you vote against the motion," Do-hyun said, "I will personally review your son's situation and discuss what options exist. That is a commitment. And if I vote with Kwon..." Then you've aligned yourself with a man whose next environment will be formal legal proceedings, and that alignment will be part of the record. The line was quiet. I'll hold, Lee Dong-wook said. Do-hyun hung up. He turned. Nia was watching him. 2 commitments in 2 hours, she said. They're both things I can actually do, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm not objecting. The board session reconvened. The next 90 minutes were the longest Do-hyun had spent since the morning he found the empty study in Seoul, and they were spent in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the version of himself from that morning. Sitting at a ranch table in New Mexico, monitoring a boardroom in Seoul through a phone relay and the tablet Baek had brought, with his wife working alongside him as a full operational partner rather than a decorative absence. Kwon pushed hard. Min-sok relayed the session in fragmented real-time. Kwon's voice, controlled and precise, presenting his documentation with the authority of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room. He challenged procedural objections. He dismissed regulatory concerns as preliminary and manageable. He was good. He had always been good. That was what 9 years had looked like from the inside. Lee Dong-wook held. Park Sung-joon held. At the 90-minute mark, the motion failed to reach 8 votes and lapsed under the charter provision. Kwon called for an immediate second motion under a different procedural mechanism. Min Seok, apparently operating on a level of procedural tenacity that Do-hyun had not previously known he possessed, filed a challenge that triggered a mandatory 24-hour cooling period before any subsequent directorship motion could be introduced. The session ended. In the ranch house 60 kilometers north of Albuquerque, Do-hyun put down the phone. Nia set down her coffee cup. Baek looked at neither of them and checked something on his tablet. Kwon is leaving the building, Baek said. His car is heading toward Gimpo, not Incheon. Domestic flight, Do-hyun said. He's running. Running where? Nia said. Macau, most likely, through a domestic connection that doesn't trigger international departure flags as quickly. Baek's voice was neutral. Do you want me to date? No, Do-hyun said. Let him run. The Geneva proceedings have his name, his documentation trail, and his financial structure. Running doesn't close the exposure. It confirms it. Baek nodded. Do-hyun stood up from the table and walked to the window. The New Mexico evening was coming in now. That particular southwestern dusk that made the land look lit from underneath, warm colors over cold air. He stood at the window and breathed. Behind him, he heard Nia get up. He heard her footsteps. She stopped a few feet to his left and looked at the same view. It's not finished, she said. The proceedings take time. There will be complications. Yes, your organization needs you present. Seoul, not New Mexico. Yes. They stood looking at the evening light. When do you go back? She said. He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the window still, her profile against the fading light. The specific person he had reduced to an absence, to a gap in his public calendar, to a logistical problem that he'd solved by erasure, who had spent 4 years quietly building the architecture that saved his empire while he was occupied replacing her in every room that mattered, who had left in a way designed to teach him rather than wound him, and had done it with more precision and more generosity than he deserved. That depends, he said. She turned. On what? She said. He held her gaze. On whether I'm going back alone, he said, or whether we're going back together to do what needs to be done. And I am not asking you to come back to what we had. I am asking whether you will stand beside me in the work, as an equal, the way you have been operating all along without my acknowledgement, while I spend whatever time it takes proving that I understand the difference between those two things. The evening light held between them. Nia looked at him for a long time. That, she said finally, is the first time you have ever asked me for something instead of arranging for me to receive something. He said nothing. She was right, and they both knew it. I'm not ready to answer that question tonight, she said. I need more than one honest conversation to rebuild what you took apart. She turned back to the window. But I will tell you this. She paused. Outside, the last of the light was going down behind the western ridgeline, the sky going deep above the high desert, and somewhere back in Seoul, a boardroom had just survived the most dangerous 12 hours of the Kong organization's existence because of a woman Do-hyun had spent 2 years treating as invisible. Tell me, he said. She turned her head slightly toward him, not quite facing him, watching the dark come in from the east. I didn't build the second contingency, she said. The one for if you didn't come. He went still. I told Patricia I had one, she said. I told Marcus I had one. I told myself I had one. For 11 days while someone sat in a blue Chevy truck on my street, and I finished the evidence chain. She paused. But I didn't build it, because I kept believing you would come. The words sat in the air of the ranch house, like something that couldn't quite be named yet. Too fragile, too recently uncovered, too honest to survive being looked at directly in the uncertain light of a night that hadn't finished settling. Do-hyun stood at the window and let it be what it was. He didn't reach for her. He didn't say anything that would collapse the moment into resolution before it was ready to be resolved. He had spent 2 years arranging things, arranging people, arranging appearances, arranging the comfortable distance between himself and anything that required him to be genuinely present. He was done arranging. He stood beside her at the window while the last of the desert light went down, and for the first time in longer than he could cleanly account for, he simply let the truth of where he was be enough. They flew back to Seoul 3 days later, not because the 3 days were easy. They weren't. They were the specific difficulty of two people carefully, painstakingly, and without the cushion of pretense, beginning to learn what it actually meant to occupy the same space. Nia kept working. Do-hyun kept working. They ate meals at the ranch table with Baek and sometimes with Reyes and his wife, who were the kind of people who understood that guests in complicated situations didn't require entertainment or explanation, only decent food and the basic dignity of being left to manage their own interior weather. On the second evening, sitting outside on the porch after the last calls to Seoul had been made and the formal proceedings in Geneva had confirmed the next phase of their timeline, Nia said, I need to know something. Do-hyun looked at her. The women, she said. The 4 women. Was any of it... She stopped, started again. Was it ever about anything other than the image? He understood what she was actually asking. She was asking whether she had been replaced in the way she feared, or replaced in the specific colder way that was, in its own terrible logic, almost more comprehensible. No, he said. It was never about anything except the image. He held her gaze. That doesn't make it less of what it was, but I want you to know the specific truth of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. She went back inside. It wasn't forgiveness. It was information. She had always operated on information, and he was learning to give it to her straight rather than managed, which was the only way she had ever wanted to receive it. On the 3rd day, she packed her bag, carefully, without drama, and said, I'll go back. I'll work from Seoul while the proceedings develop. That's pragmatic. She looked at him. It is not a decision about us. It's a decision about the work. I understand the difference, he said. She studied him. You're getting better at that. At what? Not trying to make things mean more than they currently mean. He almost smiled. It's difficult. I know, she said. It's difficult for me, too. They flew back to Seoul. The formal proceedings moved through 3 jurisdictions over the following 6 weeks, with the methodical, grinding efficiency of institutional processes that have been properly constructed and cannot be stopped once activated. Nia's evidence was, as she had built it to be, comprehensive and legally unassailable. The financial records, the communication logs, the cross-reference timeline, they told a story that didn't require interpretation or narrative construction. The facts formed their own architecture. Jae-min Kwon was located in Macau 11 days after the board session. He had not, in the end, run as far as he'd planned to. The Macau network had collapsed faster than he'd anticipated. The moment the regulatory flag hit and the Geneva proceedings went formal, the people who'd been his partners on that side of the operation concluded that association with him represented significantly more risk than it was worth. He was, when the investigators found him, staying in a mid-range hotel rather than the kind of accommodation his position had previously commanded. The distance between the two said everything about how quickly a man's value to his network drops when the protection he offered becomes a liability. Do-hyun was in a meeting in Seoul when the confirmation came through. He read the message, finished the meeting, and went to find Nia. She was in the study. not the study he'd stood in that first morning in Seoul. She had not returned to those rooms, and he had not asked her to. She'd taken a set of rooms on the other side of the house with better light and a different view of the river, and she'd made them immediately and completely her own in the way that she made spaces her own. Books appearing in organized stacks, notebooks accumulating, the particular citrus hand lotion on the desk. He knocked. She said, "Come in." She was on the phone, a professional call, her voice in the specific register she used when she was managing complex interpersonal dynamics in a negotiation context, which he now recognized as distinct from every other register she had. She held up one finger without looking at him. He sat in the chair near the window and waited. She finished the call, set the phone down, looked at him. "Kwon," he said. She nodded once. "I know. I got the notification 20 minutes ago. How are you?" She considered the question seriously, which was what she did with questions. "Relieved for the employees," she said, "tired in a way that doesn't have a quick solution." She paused. "And something else that I haven't fully identified yet." "What kind of something else?" "The kind that comes from spending 6 months building something in secret and then watching it function correctly," she said. "It should feel like satisfaction. It mostly feels like I can finally put something down that I've been carrying." He looked at her. "You built it to protect people," he said, "and it protected them." "Yes." "Including me," he said. She met his eyes. "Including you. Although that was not the primary motivation." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it what it is." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the notebook open on her desk, which he understood as a kind of permission to stay, to occupy the same space, to exist in the study without requiring her full attention. It was not a small thing. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the Han River and let the afternoon be quiet. The proceedings concluded formally 7 weeks after Kwon's detention. The verdict and its institutional record were thorough in the way that Nia's documentation had been built to make inevitable. The evidence trail was treated as exhaustive. The personnel designations protected 17 employees who might otherwise have faced secondary exposure, and the organizational record was clarified in a way that restored the damaged international partnerships with a defensible formal foundation. Hartman Group sent a communication 3 days after the formal conclusion. They wished to discuss resuming the relationship. Romano Castellano called personally, his voice carrying none of the pity that had been in it on that first call, only the directness of a man doing business with someone he respects. Yamamoto Akira sent a written communication through his office, formal and precise, indicating his interest in reconsidering the Jeju Consortium. Do-hyun handled each of these conversations himself. But before he finalized any of them, he brought the terms to Nia, not for approval, not for management, for the actual collaborative review of someone whose judgment he had spent 6 years undervaluing and was now, slowly and without fanfare, learning to treat as the resource it actually was. She changed 3 things across the 3 negotiations. Small things: a clause in the Hartman re-engagement terms, a timing provision in the Yamamoto Consortium framework, a communication protocol in the Castellano agreement. Each change was precise, quietly significant, and represented the kind of structural foresight that prevented the kind of friction that cost money and relationships in the long term. Romano, when the final Castellano terms were presented through his attorney, sent back a single line. "These terms are excellent. Give my regards to your wife." Do-hyun showed Nia the message. She read it, nodded, and went back to the call she was on. But he saw, before she turned away, something in her expression that was quieter and more genuine than anything he'd managed to put there in 2 years of expensive jewelry and social erasure. It was the specific satisfaction of being seen accurately. The International Business Summit had been on the calendar for months, one of Seoul's flagship annual events, the kind that filled the Grand Hyatt's main convention space with the collected weight of a particular tier of global commerce. Do-hyun had attended every year for the past 8 years, always with a companion, always calibrated to the image requirement of the occasion. He arrived alone. No companion, no Jiyeon, no one whose name he would have to remember for the duration of the evening and then not remember afterward. Just himself, in a suit that fit, with the particular quality of presence that came from a man who had recently been through something that stripped most of the performance out of him. The room was the room it always was. White orchids, gold light, the string quartet playing something European and forgettable, clusters of bespoke suits and architectural gowns. He worked the initial hour the way it needed to be worked, but differently than he had before. He listened to Park Sung-joon's Busan presentation, actually listened, the entire thing, with the attention it turned out the proposal genuinely warranted. He had a real conversation with the chairman of a pharmaceutical group instead of a transactional exchange dressed as a real conversation. He shook hands and meant the handshakes. He was on the East Terrace, at the window where he'd stood when her message arrived months ago. When the room's energy shifted in the particular way that happens when someone enters who is known to the people already inside. He didn't turn immediately. He registered it, the sound of it, the specific frequency of multiple people recognizing someone simultaneously. And then he turned. Nia had come in through the main entrance wearing a burgundy dress that was not architectural, not constructed for maximum visual impact from a distance, not the kind of thing that photographed as a statement. It was simply an elegant dress on a woman who had chosen to be here and knew exactly who she was. Her hair was natural and uncompromised. She wore the small gold studs she'd taken when she left, the ones that were already hers. She was surrounded within 60 seconds. Not the polite encirclement of a significant man's wife, but the genuine convergence of people who knew her and wanted proximity to her. Do-hyun watched from the terrace window and identified, in the cluster of people moving toward her, the regional director of Hartman Group, 2 members of Yamato Akira's senior team, a diplomat from the Belgian Trade Commission who had apparently worked with her on something in Brussels, and the chairman of a major Korean infrastructure conglomerate whose name Do-hyun knew, because the man had appeared in Nia's professional documentation as one of the parties in the conglomerate dispute she'd resolved 4 years ago. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who had never needed the room to validate her, only needed the room to understand, eventually, what she actually was. Do-hyun watched this for a few minutes. Then he crossed the floor. She saw him coming. Something in her expression, not quite a smile, not the full arrival of one, but the approach of it, shifted toward him as he reached her. "You came alone," she said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily, and what passed between them in that moment didn't require language, which was appropriate because language had been the problem all along. The language he'd used to arrange and manage rather than to actually communicate. The language she'd used sparingly and with precision because she'd learned gradually and at cost that the words she offered him weren't being fully received. The words didn't need to carry everything tonight. Tonight there were other things doing that work. The Belgian diplomat touched Nia's arm and said something. She turned to respond. Do-hyun stood nearby, and when the diplomat's eyes moved to him, she did something he had not anticipated. She introduced him, not as her husband, not with the weight and context that word carried now. She introduced him the way professionals introduce people whose work they respect. "This is Kang Do-hyun. He runs the Kang organization." And then, before the diplomat could position that information in the standard hierarchy, he's been working to rebuild the organization's international partnerships after an internal betrayal that affected several long-term agreements. He's done the work himself. The diplomat looked at Do-hyun with the recalibrated attention of someone who had just been given useful information. "I've heard the proceedings concluded well." "They did," Do-hyun said, "because of work that was done long before I knew it needed doing." He felt Nia's attention shift slightly in his direction. He didn't look at her, but he felt it. Later in the evening, when the formal program had concluded and the room had loosened into the less structured mingling of people who were staying because they wanted to rather than because they needed to, Do-hyun found the moment he had been, without fully admitting it to himself, building toward. He asked for 2 minutes at the podium. It was the kind of request that was granted at an event like this without much friction when the person asking was who he was. The event director gave him a window between the final speaker and the closing remarks. He took it. He stood at the podium and looked at the room, the full weight of it, the accumulated significance of the people in it, the particular exposure of standing in front of all of them with the intention of saying something real. He had written nothing in advance. He had decided specifically not to write anything in advance. "I've attended this summit for 8 years," he said, For the last 2 of those years, I brought a different woman to each event, not because of anything wrong with any of them. They were professional, capable, excellent at what they were hired to do. He paused. I hired them because I had decided that my wife didn't fit the image I wanted to project in rooms like this one. She was too quiet, too understated, not the right visual for the way I needed to be perceived. He let that sit for a moment. I want to tell you what I've learned about that decision. The room was very still. The woman I was replacing, he said, had spent 4 years building an international professional network that most of you in this room know and respect. She had resolved disputes worth billions of dollars. She had protected employees whose names she never knew in organizations she had no formal connection to. She had built, quietly and without recognition, evidence that prevented a significant betrayal of my organization, evidence I didn't know existed until she chose to show it to me. He looked out at the room. I spent 2 years deciding she didn't belong in these rooms, he said. The rooms were wrong. He stepped back from the podium. The response that followed was not the polite applause of people who are responding to a speech. It was the specific, accumulated reaction of a room full of people who recognized something true being said plainly and who had enough experience with the rarity of that to respond accordingly. Nia was standing near the East Terrace windows. She had watched the speech without expression, not moved, not embarrassed, not performing composure. Just watching, the way she watched everything, with the full and unhurried attention that was her essential characteristic. When the applause settled and the room's attention dispersed back into its natural currents, she walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "It will be in several publications by tomorrow morning." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the correction needed to be as public as the erasure was," he said, "and because I wanted you to hear it said that way, in a room where it could be properly understood what it meant." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not enough," she said, not unkindly, accurately. "No," he said, "it isn't. It's a beginning." "A beginning of what?" "Whatever we decide to build," he said. "If we decide to build it." She looked at him for a long time, the specific quality of her attention that meant she was working something through, not emotionally, but architecturally, the way she worked everything, identifying where the weight would fall and whether the structure could bear it. "I told you in Santa Fe," she said finally, "we start as equals, or we don't start." "Yes, you understand what that means operationally," she said, "not symbolically. Operationally, my professional work is mine, my name is mine. The decisions that involve my capacity and my judgment are made with me, not arranged around me." "Yes," he said, "and when you get it wrong, because you will get it wrong, not because you're a bad man, but because you're a man who has operated a certain way for a long time, you don't manage me when I tell you. You listen." "Yes," he said, "I will get it wrong, and I will listen." She looked at him. "You've rebuilt broken things before," he said. It was the phrase from her notebook, the note in small handwriting in the back section of the file, which he had read on a concrete floor in Osaka, and which had stayed with him across every mile between there and here. Something shifted in her expression. The almost smile arrived more fully this time. "I've rebuilt broken things before," she confirmed, "but not everything broken is worth rebuilding." "Is this?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. She looked past him for a moment at the room that had known her before he acknowledged her, the room that had given her a standing ovation not for her marriage or her suffering, but for her work, her actual work, the thing she had built in quiet rooms while he was occupied elsewhere. Then she looked back at him. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. "When you've done the work that you said you'd do, and I've watched you do it, and we've had enough honest mornings that the honest evenings start to feel natural." She paused. "Then ask me." It was not yes. It was also not no. It was the specific answer of a woman who had stopped operating on hope alone a long time ago and had learned, at significant personal cost, to require evidence before she committed to anything. It was, he understood, the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. 6 months, he said. She nodded. They left the summit separately and arrived home by different routes, which was where they still were. Separate routes, same destination, The particular distance of two people renegotiating the terms of a shared life without the shortcuts of pretense or the false compression of a single dramatic resolution. The following weeks were ordinary in their difficulty and extraordinary in their honesty. He reviewed Park Sung-joon's Busan proposal and found it genuinely strong in 3 areas and structurally weak in 2. He told Park Sung-joon both things directly, and they worked through the weak sections together over 2 meetings that were nothing like the transaction at the gala. He spoke with Lee Dong-wook about his son's debt situation and arranged, through a legitimate organizational fund that had existed for years and been underused, a restructuring that didn't carry the weight of a favor owed. It was a facility designed for exactly that purpose, and Lee Dong-wook's son qualified for it straightforwardly. Neither of these things were gestures. They were the ordinary work of a man trying to operate differently in the world he already inhabited. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, to leave her study door alone when it was closed. He learned that the specific citrus smell of her hand lotion was lemon and something else he couldn't name. He learned that she took her coffee with nothing in it, and that she read at least 1 chapter of something before she could sleep, and that she was, when she was deep in a complex piece of professional work, completely unreachable in the most absolute and unself-conscious way, absent from the room in the specific manner of a person whose mind has left for somewhere it's needed, with no awareness of how extraordinary that complete absorption was to watch. He told her one morning at the kitchen table when she'd looked up from a notebook to find him watching her that she was extraordinary to watch when she worked. She looked at him over the notebook. "You're watching me work," she said. "Yes. That's new." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you for about 3 weeks. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make it about me noticing." She looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said slowly, "is actually a very considered thing to say." "I've been practicing considered. I can tell." She went back to the notebook. But before she dropped her eyes fully, "It suits you better than managed." It was small. It was not a declaration. It was not the return of everything that had been damaged or the closing of the distance that 2 years of systematic erasure had opened. It was one ordinary morning in a kitchen with the Han River outside the window, and a woman at a table with a notebook and a cup of black coffee telling a man that she was paying attention to the fact that he was changing. It was enough. It was, in the specific and unhurried way of things that might eventually become more, exactly enough. 6 months later, on an evening in late spring when Seoul was at the particular peak of its brief best, warm air and long light, and the river moving below the city with the patient indifference of water that had been there before the city and would be there after, Do-hyun found Nia on the east terrace with a glass of wine and a view of the skyline going gold. He sat beside her. He did not ask immediately. He had learned, over 6 months of difficult and honest work, that the moments that mattered most were not served by being rushed toward their conclusion. They sat for a while in the evening. Then she said, without turning, "You were going to ask me something." "Yes," he said. She turned her head. "I've been watching," she said, "for 6 months, the way you asked me to." "I know. Park Sung-joon's Busan project. The fund for Dong-wook's son. The way you handle the board sessions now, you ask questions you don't know the answers to instead of directing toward the answers you've already decided on." She paused. "The calls you've stopped making at 2 in the morning because you understood that the people on the other end were also people." He said nothing. He listened. "You are not a changed man," she said. "That's not what I'm saying. You are a man in the process of changing. That's harder. It doesn't have a clean endpoint, and it doesn't always look like progress from the inside." She looked at him. "But it's real. I can tell the difference between real and performed. You know I can." "I know," he said. She looked at the river for a moment. "You asked me in Santa Fe if there was room to begin again," she said. "Yes." "You asked me at the summit if what we had was worth rebuilding." "Yes." She turned fully toward him now, the evening light on her face, the river behind her, the city going quiet in the slow way that cities go quiet when the day has exhausted itself and something gentler is taking over. "I've rebuilt broken things before," she said, "but this is the first time I've been asked to build something new in the place where the broken thing was." He met her eyes. "Is there a difference?" he said. "Yes," she said.
Rebuilding restores what was. Building new requires both people to agree on what they actually want, not what they assumed they wanted, not what looked correct from the outside. She paused. So I'm asking you, what do you actually want? He had thought about this. Not in the way he thought about business, not in the way he thought about problems, but in the harder, slower way of a man learning to be honest with himself about things he'd spent years managing around. I want to be in the room with you, he said. The actual room, not a version of you I've arranged to be manageable. I want your opinion before I make decisions that affect people we're both responsible to. I want to know what you're working on, and have you know what I'm working on, and have those two things be genuinely connected instead of occupying the same house like parallel lives. He paused. I want to deserve the word you've never said about me. She looked at him. What word? She said. Trusted, he said. Romano said it. Yamada said it. Your whole network understood it. You built an empire's worth of professional relationships on the foundation of people knowing that your word and your judgment were worth trusting. He held her gaze. You've never said that word about me. I want to earn it. The evening held them. The light on the river was the last of the day's light, going copper at the edges, the city beginning to come on in pieces around them. Windows, bridges, the long, slow glow of soul finding its night shape. Nia looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I never said you weren't capable of it. No, he said, you didn't. I said you weren't paying attention. Yes. You're paying attention now. Yes, he said. I am. She looked at the river, then back at him. And what was in her face then was not the performance of forgiveness, not the theater of a dramatic reconciliation, not anything that could be captured cleanly in a single word or gesture. It was the specific, complex, eyes-open expression of a woman who had counted every cost and arrived, after 6 months of careful watching, at a decision. Then we start, she said, as equals. From here. He nodded. From here, he said. They sat on the terrace as the evening completed itself around them. The river moving below, the city settling into its night, the spring air warm enough that neither of them moved to go inside for a long time. There was no dramatic gesture, no grand pronouncement, nothing that would photograph well for the rooms he'd once cared so much about. Only two people, and the particular quiet of something real beginning, looking at the same river from the same terrace, at the end of a day that had cost them both a great deal and given them something, finally, that was worth exactly what it had cost. The light went the rest of the way down. They stayed.